Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Finley C. Campbell, chair, spokesperson, and one of the founders of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council. Right on. We're about to experiment with a new way for us to gather as UUs and non-UUs, at least for some of us. In a real sense, we're kicking off this idea of a national UU gathering, which will be followed on tomorrow by the Mid-America region, and then in June by the GA. So we're sort of the vanguard. We had thought about canceling our convocation, but decided that the issue was too important to cancel or reschedule. Now I'm going to read some things that are on the program for those who don't see it. First thing we'll see is a symbol called our logo, which in the old days stood for Black and White Unite and Fight. It was an old Union slogan. Now it means the unity of the light and dark-skinned people of the world, or more precisely, toward the unity of the light and dark-skinned people of the world. And on our order of service, it says, let us never forget that despite our varied political, economic beliefs, we are the members of UUMUAC, and we as the members of UUMUAC see our council as basically a religious organization, an interdependent web or part of the great UU religious tradition. That's me quoting myself. So the order of service says next, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., people coming in and out as they wish or staying for the whole day. The first annual convocation of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council, UUMUAC, pronounced UUMUAC, AKA the MAC. Our theme is, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? This is derived from the title of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book. I consider him one of the non-UU patron saints of multiracial Unitarian Universalism. We commemorate his assassination on April 4th, 1968, with this convention. I want to introduce Brother Todd Eklof for an informal Q&A. And just want to welcome you to this activity, my brother. He and I share a common Baptist background. Unfortunately, he abandoned the true path and went on a better path. So introducing Brother Todd Eklof. He'll be more formally introduced later on in the day, but right now, here's his opportunity to kind of share some of his thoughts in general, looking at the world around us, which is in much great peril, And so we'll start off with a very simple question. What actually stimulated you to really decide to write this book? I mean, a lot of things were going on, but what was the thing that really said this is enough, and what is called the straw that broke the camel's back? What was that? Share that with us, please.
Boy, there's such a multifaceted question, but let's go back to the tradition that you and I share, and maybe some others here do as well, and that is the Baptist tradition. A lot of folks don't realize that the Unitarians and the Baptists really came from a second form of Reformation that was really started by the Anabaptists, who went on to become Baptist, Mennonites, and Unitarians. And what they shared in common was a deep reverence for autonomy of individuals and the sort of what the Baptists call the individual priesthood of the believer, which means there can be no intermediary between oneself and their God or the theology they adopt. So there was a tremendous sense of respect for the individual choice and for the individual in general in the Baptist tradition. The reason they were initially called Anabaptists was a bit of a slur. They were the baptize againers.
Yeah, right.
They didn't accept infant baptism because infants are not capable of choosing their religion for themselves, and it should not be forced upon them. So they were called the baptize againers because they baptized people as adults of their own free will. And that really that appreciation for individual autonomy and freedom has remained a part of the Baptist tradition, and at least part of their doctrine to this day. In fact, it was the Baptists who gave us the Baptist Joint Committee, which is an advocacy group that has been around for over a century now, that fought for the separation of church and state in this country, and they're still fighting for the separation of church and state in this country. So when I was a Southern Baptist, I became a Southern Baptist as a teenager when I became a born-again Christian in the late 1970s. And during the 10 years I was a Southern Baptist, it just so happened to be a period in which a small group of people got together. And this is not conspiracy theory. They named it, and we're proud of it. Got together in an office in Texas and said, hey, within 10 years, we can take over this entire institution. All we need to do is load all of the boards of our various institutions, our seminaries, our mission board, and all of these boards with people who are of our mind. And we can do that with a wedge issue. And that wedge issue was the inerrancy of Scripture. All Baptists love the Bible, and when they thought the Bible was under attack, that got the votes necessary to load these leadership positions up. And within a decade, just as predicted, they were able to take over the entire Southern Baptist Convention, which has since become, notorious as a very rigid fundamentalist organization. Obviously, I wasn't able to be part of that, not only because my own theological opinions were changing, but because I maintained that core principle of valuing what we call the worth and dignity of every person, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the priesthood of the believer, individual autonomy and individual choice in religion. And so that really, I have to say, is just a core of who Todd Eklof is, and I think a core of who many Unitarian Universalists are and we have been. And so when I saw, I really saw it over the years, this sort of shift, this slow shift, if you will. It wasn't very alarming to me, this shift away from those principles. But then in 2017, as a lot of you know, there was a hiring decision that really led to very odd behavior, in my opinion, in which one individual felt that they had been discriminated against, and that led to a rather extreme accusation that the UUA is a white supremacist organization. And good people were getting hurt in the process of that claim.
Right. Preach.
it bothered me to great extent. And then when I went to and became involved actually in the General Assembly of 2017, and it was only a few months after Donald Trump had been elected, and I had gone anticipating, we would be focusing largely on what we can do to respond to this political crisis in our nation and in our world. And it was never brought up. Instead, we focused almost exclusively on this idea that we are a white supremacist organization. And that's when I thought, this is so unreasonable. If we're committed to reason as we claim, we need to evaluate this in an honest and open way. And I wrote the last essay of my book. I started writing it then, thinking I would just put it on email or online and hope people see it. And as I was finishing that, I happened to read The Coddling of the American Mind, which had just come out in 2018. And I was blown away. I said, wow, this is exactly what I see is going on in our association. So I thought, if I can write another essay to make comparisons between what they're saying and what's going on and what I perceive is going on in the UUA, it would be quite enlightening. And I thought, well, maybe I could make copies of these and hand them out. And then, of course, remembered we live in an amazing age, and it's much easier to just publish a book and a lot cheaper to get copies. So I wrote those two essays and bridged them with what I thought would be the page turner, the controversial center essay, I Want a Divorce. Thought I have to have something to get people to open the book. It turns out I didn't have to worry about that. But anyway, that was the process, and I realized, just about 6 months out, that with the General Assembly coming to Spokane, I had a singular opportunity to help enlighten our wider membership about what's going on. If I could get one book into the hands of somebody from just about every congregation in our country, then maybe we can start to dialogue about this. It turns out I was able to afford about 750 books. They came the week of the GA. I mean, while the GA had already started, I didn't even know if I was going to have them. And I handed out maybe 200 at the most before all hell broke loose, and I got banned. And the book is not a perfect book. Obviously, no book is, but I didn't have time to get an editor on it or anything. And I take a bit of pride in knowing that this perfect little book, in which I only handed out a fraction of what I wanted to give away, has succeeded so much in at least creating a conversation, painful and difficult, and as conflictual as it has become at this point. I'm still hopeful that maybe someday we'll actually start talking seriously about these matters. So that's a long answer, but I have to primarily say it's because of who I am and who I believe we are traditionally as Unitarian Universalists that would force me to do this. I knew it wasn't going to be well received by everyone, and that it might cause some animus towards me. But again, you have to do what you feel is right, regardless of the consequences. So that's the background.
All right, let's throw it open to the broader collective that we have here. By the way he described the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention resonates with me in a way in which our own little group.
I just wanted to mention that I've been involved in some of these issues since you and I, Finley and I, met in Tulsa, Oklahoma at a UU seminar in 2009. There were 3 different UU congregations in Beaufort, South Carolina, Culpeper, Virginia, now Oberlin, Ohio. And I've been very disappointed in the direction the UU has taken, supporting the efforts that we're making.
Okay, Carol, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Carol Knight with the Wildflower Congregation in Austin, Texas. I was an active member of First Church, the big church in Austin, Texas, years ago. And in 1998, I had a vision of a Unitarian church in South Austin. So I went to the board of First Church, and they were wonderfully supportive. So we've been meeting ever since 2001 with a lot of work and money by a whole bunch of people. Well, last year in our church newsletter, our weekly news, an introduction to their new anti-racism program went out. And in it, they said the founders of Wildflower based the church on a culture of white supremacy. As you can imagine, that really got me. So I spent a lot of time agonizing over, am I really that? So I went to talk to the minister at some length, and then the board, as did Michael and Mary, who are on this chat as well. And I'm just wondering, Todd, two things. How do you cope with this emotionally? I'm having a real hard time with it. It seems like our church has become unkind in its approach. And then do you have, or does anybody have, links to other congregations who are handling this with the same intent, but with a different approach, a kinder, more respectful approach? That's all.
Really good question. And first of all, I would say that, my book is not about racism per se.
Right.
It's about Unitarian Universalism and our inability to communicate peacefully for some reason about this particular subject. And I think a lot of it is because one side has become very extreme in its approach, extremist to the point where it wants to disallow any conversation or any dissent. So, but what has happened, what helps me emotionally is to remember that as helped Dr. King and helps us all when we realize we're not alone, especially when we're in the midst of suffering. And it's important to recognize that this is a really global event throughout Western culture in particular. And in fact, there's a video I could recommend on YouTube, a guy named Konstantin Krisis. Like Constantine with no E. He's a Russian-born immigrant to England, and was interviewed recently by John Anderson, who's the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. A wonderful hour 15-minute long interview about this phenomenon, and Krisis really just speaks of it so eloquently, particularly about the dynamics, but also says, this is a threat to Western culture. This is an imminent threat to the continuance of Western culture as we know it, particularly threatening the things the best that Western culture has to offer. And I know there are some out there who don't think it has to offer anything, or there even is a Western culture. But the highest aspirations, at least, of Western culture have been democracy and freedom of the individual and creating egalitarian societies. So we're still striving for that, but at least those are our principles. How do we make that happen? And that's what's under threat right now. And it really began, many years ago, at least in the 80s, in our academic institutions here in the U.S. And there have been people writing about this for decades within Unitarianism and outside of Unitarianism. There's people warning about what was coming almost as soon as the association formed in 1961, only because, again, as I point out in my book, we haven't dealt with our differences in a way that we can move forward without running into a hurdle like this. So part of it is just knowing that we're not alone. In the Unitarian Universalist Association, I can only speak anecdotally, but I know there are many churches out there, including yours, that are going through a lot of pains around this. There are congregations that are practically 100% on our side, on my side, if you will. And they have adopted resolutions with little controversy that they have sent out. One of those, for example, would be the Chandler Unitarian Church in Arizona. Another would be the Salem UU community in Oregon. But then you also have congregations where there seems to be it's almost the opposite, where folks really buy into the current anti-racism, anti-oppression agenda. And then you have congregations like yours and like mine, in which there is a lot of controversy and conflict caused by this debate. And you know, I don't know what to say. It's kind of like the Democrats in response to the Republicans these days. We have a very odd authoritarian president in power who is not held accountable by the legislators of his own party, who happen to be in a majority position. And so the rest of us are left wondering, well, what do we do? I mean, if you break the rules, and nobody's there to enforce them, what can we do? And in our congregations, we largely operate, you know, on the promise that we're going to treat each other respectfully. And if nobody does that, we don't have any recourse. We're not legal institutions. We can't force people to behave the way we claim we're going to. And so that's not a positive answer in the sense that there's something we can do. I can't draw a direct line to an answer. But I think it's important just to know, Carol, that you're not alone. And I'm really sorry that you're going through that. And, you know, Dr. Johnson has also, you know, been in touch from time to time and let me know, you know, kind of what you guys are going with. And it's really hard. And again, you know, it's kind of interesting, you know, the Buddha, you know, when he was Siddhartha, kind of the myth is that he tried to find the meaning of life, and he first became an aesthetic. You know, he overindulged in everything. He thought pleasure was the meaning of life, and it didn't work. So he went the opposite direction and became an ascetic, and that didn't work either. And he found the middle way. And in ancient Rome, when after the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians Athens laid in ruins. They were scattered about, and there was the encroaching Roman Empire. They were losing their freedoms, and so they were depressed and despondent and disenfranchised, very, very much like many of us feel today. And philosophy had to leave the sort of esoteric, abstract concerns of cosmology and physics and get real. People wanted to know how they could find eudaimonia, which means good spirit. How can we be happy? How can we be content? And a lot of philosophies emerged to answer that. One was Epicureanism or hedonism, which is Buddha's overindulgence, right? And the other was cynicism, which was the opposite, and said, no, let's not partake in pleasure. Let's have very aesthetic lives. But ultimately, Stoicism emerged, and Stoicism was not the middle way. It was not the same answer as the Buddha. It said, no, contentment has nothing to do with pain or pleasure. It has to do with our virtues, which is what we would call our values. The only way to find peace of mind, to find good spirit, to be of cheer, is to live by our virtues no matter the consequences. If you can find pleasure and it doesn't detract from your virtues, then by all means participate in pleasant things. If you can follow your virtues and avoid pain, then by all means avoid pain. But the point is to follow your virtues. And if that means you're in an unhappy place because of it, or a painful place because of it, so be it. We cannot be content beings if all we're doing is seeking pleasure to avoid pain. We can only be happy beings when we are fulfilled, when the fullest expression of our soul is allowed to flourish and to express itself. And that's what we have to do in this situation, regardless of the consequences.
We do have to endure, but we also have to make some plans to oppose it in whatever form we can, and also to search for allies to help with that feeling of being overwhelmed and really disappointed with our church and all those other kinds of things. At our church, we, just before the corona outbreak, we had scheduled what we call at First U a first forum on the fifth principle. And the ministers at the church tried to block that. I developed a reading list of the documents that have come out recently, including the responses to Todd's work, both pro and con, and they would not let that be published in the emails that went out to people. I mean, it seemed like people might want to read about it before they came to a first forum to discuss it, but that was not allowed. So that was very disappointing. On the other hand, there were lots of people who were very interested in participating in this. So you have to take the good with the bad and focus on the part of the glass that's half full, I guess.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Brother Todd while we got him here in an informal way? I see Marie Cobb's hands up. Go ahead.
One of the things that I wanted to also say in relation to what's going on at First U, we had scheduled the Nominations Affair Committee meet every month, and one of the things we had decided to do is to have open discussion on the Gadfly papers. So we scheduled a 3-month discussion on that in preparation to having a forum where the whole church can get involved in a discussion instead of this, people meeting in groups and saying different things and not having an open discussion about it. And unfortunately, our minister, he didn't actually come out and say we couldn't do it, but he did say that he thought that it was divisive. But nonetheless, because the Social Justice Council, who the DAC is under the Social Justice Council, has the right to have a forum on things that they think are appropriate. So we had scheduled the forum, but unfortunately the Corona thing happened, and right now, like everything else, is put on the shelf. But we do intend to have an open discussion on that, as well as Bobby mentioned, the Fifth Principle Project.
All right. Any other questions or comments for Brother T? I see Greg Olson next, and then Frank Casper afterwards. Go, Greg.
Yeah, I'm with Wildflower, the same church that Carol is at. And I think the thing that has concerned us is that we have a ministerial candidate now being considered, Sarah Scotchko, who delivered a very negative, mean-spirited sermon, about a 33-minute sermon, October 20th, in which she criticized Todd in a very negative way. So we're trying to deal with the fact that we have a ministerial committee that selected her as the best for now, and she's going to be meeting with different groups now, and she hasn't been selected yet. But here we have someone who's, I think, very divisive. And how do you respond to someone like that? She hasn't been ordained yet, but I guess she will be in June or sometime later. So anyway, that's sort of my concern. I've read the Gadfly papers, and I've listened to her sermon, and I just find it very upsetting. And a lot of us, or at least some of us, are upset about it in the congregation. And we're just sort of struggling. How can we deal with this minister that we may now have, depending on how the congregation votes, who said some very, I think, divisive things. She called Reverend Eklof a racist, that he was intellectually dishonest, that he was dismissive, and it was morally reprehensible. And she goes on like this, like I said, for a 33-minute sermon. So anyway, it was upsetting for a lot of us to listen to her sermon. And our question is, how can we best deal with this? It's sort of like, for some people, the ends justify the means. And so I'm trying to somehow let people know that we're not against anti-racist programs. What we are questioning is how we go about, what's the method that we can best achieve the same goals that we agree with these people. But some people, I guess, seem to think that if you question the means, that you must also question the ends. So it's that ends means balance, I guess, that is an issue here.
Yeah, I can't really comment on your potential candidate. I mean, I think that people get to speak for themselves. That's what we're all about. And then one of the cherished obligations and freedoms of a congregation is to determine if that person is going to work for them. So I hope whatever works out, that those of you who will be participating in this have the ability to use the full force of whatever rules you have established in your bylaws for selecting ministerial candidates, and that you'll be free to express your opinion. But I think that's the real point here, what we're finding is that there are many of us who are not free to express their opinions. I know in my congregation, whenever I speak about this, I'm accused of being defensive. It's all I can talk about, from some of the very same individuals who say I refuse to talk about it. So it puts us in a double bind in which we have no way out. But what we're really calling for, and I think all of us would agree, that we obviously Unitarian Universalism wants to continue to improve conditions of racism and oppression in this country on all levels. The terms anti-oppression and anti-racism, I mean, on the outset, how can you argue against them? It's like the inerrancy of the Bible. It becomes an impenetrable wedge issue. But it's kind of like, George W. Bush was so good at naming things the opposite of what he meant by them, the Clear Skies Act or the Protect Our Forest Act or whatever it was, when in fact he was destroying the forest and smothering the skies. So what UUMUAC is all about is saying, no, there's another way to deal with this. And in fact, the anti-racism, anti-oppression model, I don't think is completely flawed. I really don't. What I argue in my book is that, the more we talk about group identity, which is necessary, we have to talk about it. It's one thing for me to simply say, hey, we're all one. We're really all one species. That doesn't prevent people who are suffering because they're being discriminated against for arbitrary genetic qualities from suffering. So obviously we need to address this. But what we're saying is, we also need to lift up our common humanity. At the same time, we're talking about how certain identities are under duress in our society. We have to remember that we also are, as UUMUAC says, part of one human community. And the only reason we're going to care about the marginalization of groups based on arbitrary reasons is because we recognize, these are our brothers and sisters and cousins, and we have to make sure that everybody has equal rights and is treated fairly. So those of us who are arguing against what we see going on in the UUA have the same goals, but we're not allowed to say what I just said in a way that can have serious discussion. We're immediately demonized, as Greg said, as being a racist, somebody who's intellectually dishonest, and somebody who's a monster. And they go to that position without even really listening to what's said or reading what's said. It's an instantaneous, instinctive, emotional response to shut down any dissent, which is why we're in real trouble, because these are not Unitarians who behave this way. This is not an expression of Unitarianism. So, that would be my response to you, Greg, that, we could work through this if we could just talk, because we ostensibly all have the same goals, unless the real goal of some is just power and authority, and their commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression is just a ruse that doesn't mean anything, but is only an opportunity to take control of an ancient, venerable tradition and its institutions. That would be a cynical thing. But I mean, what we're asking for is is just to be able to talk about this without demonizing people we disagree with. That should be a norm. That has been a norm. That's a value in Unitarian Universalism, and it's not happening today.
According to my list here, Frank, are you next? Okay, Frank.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Jay just arrived, so we're both here together. And I want to say first, Todd, that this is not to distract from the quality of your book, but I was not drawn to your book by the book itself. I was drawn to your book by the response to the book on Facebook and elsewhere, which I consider to be, well, I'm not quite sure what term to use here, but when I ordered the book, it was just something I had to read because I thought I was going to be reading the rantings of a lunatic. That's what the response made me think. Certainly, quite the contrary was the case when I finally got the book. But I think subsequent, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, and I'm still, I think, or even more convinced that quite apart from your book, I think that's not the issue anymore. I think the response has been the issue. The response of leadership has been the issue. That's what we're really discussing here. And I want to ask you, in terms of that response, the criticisms, I think, are many, legion, and very persistent, but they break down into two. And I want to ask you about the two of them are the method of distribution. You talked about that in your remarks. And also another more substantive, I would call it, criticism has been that you have persistently and consistently misrepresented people, circumstances, and so on in your book. And I was wondering if that criticism specifically has led you in any way to grapple with maybe you have, maybe you haven't. How do you respond to those?
Really good questions. I mean, firstly, I would say you're right. My book was but a catalyst for an eruption. And still, few people really talk about the book. I mean, even my critics don't really ever quote anything out of the book. They talk about, as you said, the way it was given out, or my process, or my motivations, or that I misrepresent the truth. They complain about what I didn't say rather than what I did say, or dealing with what I did say. So I think these are really ways to avoid dealing with the contents of the book. But the immediate backlash to the book, the strong backlash, which resulted in my banning and request from UUs to don't even bother to read this, really caused people to pick it up and read it. I mean, I sold a lot more books than I ever intended to give away. I can tell you that, because of the controversy. And I think you're right. And my book was really about causing dialogue, regardless of the quality of the book. And so I think the book has done its job for that reason. As far as the way I gave it out, I wrote a book for Unitarian Universalist, and I gave it away to Unitarian Universalist at a meeting of Unitarian Universalist. I don't understand why that's not brilliant. It makes sense to me. What was my process? Want a book? I wrote a book about some dissenting opinions. Would you like it? You know, did I ask permission? Who? Did I need to ask permission? And what would have been the response if I did? Right? No way are you giving that book out. This was a book that was written after observing the authoritarian assault on lots of UUs for giving dissenting opinions. I wasn't about to ask permission of those who are forcing people into silence. We all, you know, I think we'll be hearing from Reverend Richard Trudeau later on, who was censured months before I was for expressing very similar concerns. As for the mischaracterization of individuals, maybe I did, but I wrote that book with the information that I had. I think that, you know, the most controversy I've heard is around what I describe as the Loretta incident. And, you know, it's been dismissed as hearsay and inaccurate, and I wasn't there. You know, I wasn't at the crossing of the Delaware either, but I think it happened. And you know, my writing, I don't consider my writing of that event anecdotal. I interviewed the two gentlemen who were directly involved in what had happened and got their side of the story, a side that was never told. And I lifted explanations, official explanations off of letters that were distributed by the Loretta's president at the time and a staff or volunteer member who had also written an explanation saying that people expressed concerns that these white men images had been put online. So you know, there is nothing there that is not verifiable, that one can't go and look at the source information or rely upon the direct quotes that I gave from the two men who were there, in addition to an anonymous member of Loretta who was also there for the first time. So that's the story I told. And, you know, I think it was an honest perspective from those who were there, from testimonies of those who were there, including Loretta, the explanations Loretta leadership gave.
We're having to share. I took my mask off, so I think it's okay here on the video conference.
I know you're not going to rob me now.
Yeah. Well, Todd, I want to say that I actually appreciated the content of the book. And oddly, I was one of the few of the people I've spoken to that really enjoyed your conversation on logic.
Thank you.
Because I truly believe that we are being hoodwinked in a number of different ways, as you've expressed in the book, in terms of false premises, et cetera, speaking as a mathematician. So, but what the question I'm going to come down to is your awareness of how your book has become a symbol of something. So when Frank and I sent out our general letter about our fifth principle to all the denominations, I had an hour and a half of finger wagging meeting with the senior leadership in my church. And it was really a criticism of the Gadfly papers. And I learned that if you say Gadfly papers, that it invokes a immediate response that seems not thought through, but this is the response that we now give. Are you aware of that response, and how do you interpret that response, that negative immediate reaction to the mention of your book? Oh, by the way, I also bought 15 copies and gave it to my bookstore to sell. They all sold out.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you starting off by commenting about the first essay that I wrote, which I assumed initially was going to be the only essay on reason. My thoughts behind that, again, were, you know, we say that we're devoted to reason. This is one of our fundamental values. And it's even listed in our bylaws as one of our fundamental sources of spiritual growth, to protect us from the idolatries of mind and spirit. So I wanted to really exemplify very, very rigid sort of logical practice to demonstrate what that commitment would look like if we took it seriously. Now, logic is not accessible, and nor is it natural. Most of us think we're perfectly logical people because we have a feeling, and then we wrap it in narrative and justify it and say, you know, I'm a logical person, I'm a rational, reasonable person. But, you know, logic is kind of like algebra or trigonometry. You have to learn it and you have to practice it. But there are some very simple things we can do to be reasonable. What I think the book inevitably did, you know, quite unintentionally and by accident on my part, I mean, I never expected it to happen, was when we got two different historic documents, one signed eventually by over 500 white ministers, and another, my letter of censure, both of which refer to logic as a classic form of white supremacy. So what has happened is the official and unofficial word now is that that statement in our bylaws no longer counts, that reason itself is a form of evil that has led to white supremacy. And we no longer can use reason. So it really does represent the sort of postmodern milieu that we're in now, where there can be no objectivity, there are no empirical facts that we can rely upon, that truth is whatever any individual makes of it, and it can't be verified, and anybody who counters another's truth is the enemy and is dangerous and is harmful and an offender. So that chapter really did us all a favor because it clarified where we're at in our religion. So I'm very grateful for that particular chapter, even though as much as I tried to make it people speak so that folks could understand it, I don't think I succeeded. A lot of folks still felt like it was very boring.
Welcome to the Gadfly Papers. It codified my thinking in a number of ways in a coherent and well-stated way. Not a book without flaws, but it did a lot of good things. Here is my comment. Todd was just speaking and introduced the notion of Stoicism into things. It's an idea that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and I've been trying to work up a sermon on that myself. When you talked about Stoicism, you talked about knowing our virtues, extolling our virtues, having virtues which we wish to be true to. And I think this is the key notion about the whole Gadfly issue. We have virtues, but the question is, what virtues are they? And to what degree do we share these virtues and agree upon them? Is it the case that our virtues are being supplanted by other virtues? So that is my comment, and I will take a response from Todd.
It's a really good question, and I hope we can get to the Clarks after this question, or this response to your question, Paul, which is a very good one, because we have to be fair, right? I mean, and I'll say more about this in my talk later on this evening in my address. You know, the past is really important. We ignore the past at our peril, at the peril of the future. But we also can't cling to the past in a way that causes us to become so draconian, out of touch, that we fail to make progress. So examining our values, I think, is important, lest we become so conservative in the way we live that we become afraid to move forward and letting go. So that, you know, to have our virtues or not to have our virtues, that is the question. Are the principles of reason, the Enlightenment principles, which really shaped American Unitarianism in particular, do those Enlightenment principles of at least striving for, aspiring towards freedom of conscience and reason and the uplifting of our common humanity, what I like to call now the humanistic ethic, that we should concern ourselves with the welfare of all humans, including the environment, that of the environment and other creatures within it. Are those perennial values? Are those values that are just something some particular culture made up longer have any meaning in modern times, or are they perennial answers to ethical questions? I think yes, they are. Some think no, they aren't, obviously. There have been many cultures that have been based upon the squelching of freedom of speech and the squelching of our common humanity in the name of controlling others, keeping the peace, even in the name of equality. You look at some of the societies that emerged in response to the labor movement of the early 20th century, in which they wanted equality, what we would call economic equality for workers around the world, a very noble cause, but they ended up resulting in, the starvation of millions, and then decades of suppression of the freedoms of individuals. And if we adopt the humanistic ethic, the humanistic ethic should be about providing our fundamental needs as human beings. Part of caring for the welfare of humans is making sure we have enough to eat, we have proper clothing and shelter and healthcare and safety and security and all of those fundamentals. But human health also requires that we're able to unfold as individuals, that we're able to fully express our full potential. In a healthy humanistic society with a small h has to empower people to unfold. And so I think that to squelch freedom in the name of equality is wrongheaded, that we have to have both, and they don't always play well together, and we have to wrestle with that. And so, Paul, your question really is an ethical dilemma, and all ethical questions are really dilemmas, because you can't do anything without having some sort of negative response. It's a dance, it's a balance. And I can't answer that question directly, but what I would say is that is the question before us. The question is, are our values still valid? And if so, are we responsible for moving forward with them? I would define our fundamental values. Other people have defined them differently, but I think, again, as Unitarian Universalists, inspired by Enlightenment principles, our highest aspirations are reason, freedom of conscience, and the humanistic ethic.
Our small fellowship in DeKalb, Illinois seems to feel, for the most part, very independent from UU on a larger level. Most people don't seem to have read the UU World at all. And when Lana and I heard about Todd's book, probably through Facebook, we were excited to read it, said, yes, a lot of this resounds for us. Lon bought 18 copies and loaned them to people and said, let me know what you think of this. And the response was crickets. Nobody.
Yeah, there were 6 people that expressed interest in actually doing an in-depth discussion. And I have not opened that discussion primarily because there is nobody in leadership in the fellowship who is part of that group of 6.
Neither have we participated in any of the activities suggested by the UUA. So it just seems that our little group that's getting littler all the time just feels that we're out here on our own. We're interested in certain social justice and green sanctuary kind of activities, and there's no interest in talking about this kind of thing. So that's been kind of baffling to us. Disappointing.
Yeah, let me jump in on this issue. This is one of the dangerous beliefs of groups that call themselves Unitarian Universalists, thinking they can be like a little island separated from this body that has actually given them life. It's like a little finger wants to cut itself off and say, oh, that hand, I don't have to worry about that hand. I'll just be a little finger floating out here, and then you wonder why you're dying. You have to recognize that and I'll be harsh, coming out of the historical theist and Marxist-Leninist tradition. Either you're part of a group that is growing, or you will be a part of a group that's dying. But one thing is important: you got to be a part of a group. The world we're living in now is untangling, and local realities must be seen as collectives of people who must, in many ways, help each other. If the virus has taught us anything, I call it Cyrus the virus, after a famous Persian prince. It has taught us anything. No one is an island entire unto themselves. So, you said 6 people got that book. That's the cluster. That's your nucleus. We call them nuclei, nucleus. We are the reformers. We want to reform the UUAC, not that UUA Boston thing that everybody thinks is way up there, but we began as a Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. That's where we started off. Then they sort of lopped that off in 2015. They changed the titles on your program to the GAs. The congregations and polity are now the key. You have to struggle with people that if you do not belong and involved in these kinds of struggles, you will surely die. Just tell it to you plain. One of the weaknesses of this whole shift to this dogmatic neo-racist, I call it neo-racist position, we're not doing what we started off doing, strengthening the smaller fellowships, giving them help, making them feel a part of this larger whole. That is one of the reasons why you feel like, oh, those are a bunch of crazy people in Boston, because Boston has had at this logic, not building Unitarian Universalism, but building this other phenomenon. So I want to encourage you to use the book as the beginning of a renewal of your own reformation down in DeKalb or Decatur. I lost the D. DeKalb. So yeah. Let that book become a nucleus for expanding consciousness about what we need to do. Now I'm back to somebody else who was on my list here, somebody named Jonathan Tweet, Seattle. He said, logic is not natural, but feeling like your own opinions are right is natural. All right. Jack, are you there? Jack Rice?
Finley, I'm here. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. You made a comment about maturity. Would you like to share that with Todd and the rest of us?
Well, I'll be happy to. First of all, I just want to say hello to everybody. I think this is the first I've spoken today. And Todd, it is so good to see you.
Good to see
you. I want to tell you a little story. I want to tell you a little story because almost nobody knows this. But we have various categories of membership in the UU Humanist Association, our National Humanist Association. And when Todd came by our booth at the display area in last June, with copies of his book, and we said, sure, we'll be glad to pass a few out, which we did until the thought police came by a little bit later and asked to confiscate them. And Todd, almost with no hesitation, joined our group, not with an annual membership of $60 or a 2-year membership of $108, but as a life member with $600 contribution. And I hope you don't mind my telling everybody that, Todd, because I think that just exemplifies how you are ready and prepared to act on your convictions. The comment I made in response to Jonathan was that maturity begins. He said logic isn't natural, but feeling like your own opinions are right is natural. Yes, it is. And maturity begins, I think, with being able to look with some objectivity at your own behavior and opinions. It's doable, though not easy. And I think among other things that characterizes the behavior of all of the bullies who ganged up on Todd after he distributed his book, even going so far as to say things like, my God, what's wrong with this guy? He deliberately distributed it in a way that would be influential. Well, gee whiz, how many authors do you know who made efforts to distribute their book in a way that would not be influential. I mean, what kind of garbage is this? And this was the level of self-awareness and conversation that those of us who have been on Todd's side have been putting up with for many months. And I have very little hope that the quote unquote sinners among us, the people who, in my opinion, ganged up on Todd, are going to step back and look at their own behavior and say, gee, you know, maybe censoring him was not exactly the best course of action, or calling out someone for daring to have some thoughts that others might disagree with. My God, that's all I have to say right now. Nice to see you all.